Hi, writers. So, as you've known, we started our fairy tale unit, one of my favorite units of all of third grade. Now, we've been getting to know a few fairy tales, the classic fairy tales. We read the classic Cinderella and the classic Little Red Riding Hood. Now, fairy tales are some of my favorite because these stories have been around for years and years and years and passed down from person to person to person. That's what makes them so amazing. But sometimes when these fairy tales get passed down, they get changed or adapted. Now, as I mentioned, before we can change or adapt a fairy tale, it's really important that we know the classic fairy tale well. And we're going to practice doing that together before we dive into our lesson. So I like to think of fairy tales as four main big parts. Every fairy tale has like a setup speech. We have our first small moment, then there'll be more. Then there's some type of big trouble, and the ending. So I'm going to practice using this booklet, retelling you one of the classic fairy tales that we read the other day, Little Red Riding Hood. Because remember, to make sure we know it well, then we can adapt it. So a setup speech is when they give that background information. So, for example, once upon a time, there was a little girl called Little Red Riding Hood. She was called Little Red Riding Hood because she wore a cape with a red hood all the time. Her grandmother was not feeling well, so her mom sent her with a basket of goodies to visit her grandmother. Her mother warned her, do not talk to any strangers, just go straight to your grandmother's. So do you see how I gave you that background information? Now I'm moving on to my first small moment. As Little Red Riding Hood was walking through the woods, a wolf came up to her and started talking to her. He asked her where she was going. She said to grandmother's house. So then I would keep going. Writers, right now I want you to try and retell either Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood, kind of using this template. Tell me the setup speech, the first small moment, what's that big trouble, and what happens in the end. I'm going to pause. If you need to pause here and do that, go ahead. I'm going to give you a second, pause, and try and retell. Okay. So now that you've unpaused and have tried that, we are now ready to adapt the fairy tale. An adaptation is a change, and there are tons of different ways you can adapt fairy tales, and today we're going to explore that. Let me just show you some examples of adapted fairy tales. This is called Prince Cinders, which we're actually going to be reading today. Then there's Lone Popo. This is a Little Red Riding Hood story from China. Little Roja Riding Hood. This is a Spanish version of Little Red Riding Hood. The Paper Bag Princess. This is an adaptation of Cinderella. This is Cinder Edna, another adaptation of Cinderella. And Glass Zipper Gold Sandal, another adaptation of Cinderella. So, writers, in order to change these fairy tales, we can't just dive in. We need to do an investigation and see how other authors have changed fairy tales. That way we can get ideas for our own. So today we're going to be doing an inquiry. The question we'll be researching is, what does the author seem to be trying to do when he or she changes some things in a fairy tale and not others? And most of all, how will a study of someone else's adaptations help us when we write our own? So in order to do this, normally if we were in school, I would have you go off in groups and explore a whole bunch of different ones and report back to me, which you kind of will be doing in a little. But first we need to read an adaptation together. And this one is called Prince Cinders and is by Babette Cole. And as we're reading, I want you to think in your mind, how did the author change or adapt the original Cinderella? And then we're going to keep track on our chart of different ways authors can adapt fairy tales. All right, I'm going to make myself nice and big so we can read this. Prince Cinders by Babette Cole. Again, remember, be on the lookout. How does the author change? Already, what are you noticing? The character changed, right? It's a girl. It's a boy, not a girl. And it's a prince and not a princess. Prince Cinders was not much of a prince. He was small, spotty, scruffy, and skinny. He had 3 big hairy brothers who were always teasing him about his looks. Noticing some differences? They spent their time going to the palace disco with princess girlfriends. They made poor Prince Cinder stay behind and clean up after them. When his work was done, he would sit by the fire and wish he was big and hairy like his brothers. One Saturday night, when he was watching the stars, a dirty fairy fell down the chimney. "All your wishes shall be granted," cried the fairy. "Ziz, zib, boom, tic-tac-ta, this empty chair shall be a car. Biff, bang, bong, boo, 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 to the disco you shall go." "That can't be right," said the fairy. "Toe of a rat and eye of a newt, your rags will turn into a suit." "Drat," thought the fairy. "I didn't mean a swimsuit. Your greatest wish I'll grant you. You shall be big and hairy too." Prince Cinders got big and hairy all right. "Rats," said the fairy. "Wrong again, but I'm sure it all wears off at midnight." Prince Cinders didn't know he was a big hairy monkey, because that's the kind of spell it was. He thought he looked pretty good. So off he went to the disco. The car was too small to drive, but he made the best of it. But when he arrived at the Rock and Royal Bash, he was too big to fit through the door. He decided to take the bus home. A pretty princess was waiting at the stop. "When's the next bus?" he grunted. "Eek!" Luckily, midnight struck and Prince Cinders changed back into himself. The princess thought he had saved her by frightening away the big hairy monkey. "Wait!" she shouted, but Prince Cinders was too shy. He even lost his trousers in the rush. Trousers is another word for pants. The princess was none other than the rich and beautiful Princess Lovelypenny. She put out a proclamation to find the owner of the trousers. "The Princess Lovelypenny decrees that she will marry whoever fits the trousers lost by the prince who saved her from being eaten by the big hairy monkey. Fitting sessions begin today." Every prince for miles around tried to force the trousers on, but the trousers refused to fit any of them. Of course, Prince Cinder's brothers all fought to get the trousers in at once. "Let him try," commanded the princess, pointing at Cinders. "They won't fit that little squirt," sneered his brothers. But they did. Princess Lovelypenny proposed immediately. So Prince Cinders married Princess Lovelypenny and lived in luxury happily ever after. And Princess Lovelypenny had a word with the fairy about his big hairy brothers. Whom she turned into house fairies, and they flitted around the palace doing the housework forever and ever. Okay, writers, do you see? For sure, and we can tell that this author changed a lot of the original Cinderella. Let's think right now. What ways did the author adapt or change the fairy tale? Well, to begin, one of the big ways the author changed the fairy tale is he changed the characters. For example, the princess is now a prince. So he changed it from a girl to a boy. They also changed the way the fairy godmother was. It wasn't this beautiful fairy godmother. It was a dirty godmother, right? So there was from a fancy godmother to a dirty one. To a dirty godmother. Okay, so some other things that changed were they changed the item, right? Instead of a glass slipper, it was the trousers. So sometimes they change the big important items. Let's see, can I add that? Change the important items. Like I said, glass slipper to trousers or pants. So writers, what your job today is you are going to investigate some more adapted fairy tales and tell me other ways authors adapt fairy tales, because these are just some examples, but there's a lot of other ways that they do so. So what you're going to do is go on Epic. And remember, I have assigned you your fairy tales books. And this has a bunch of adapted fairy tales. Now, I know you already read 2 on Wednesday, but I want you to just read 1 more today. And then on your slides, you are going to tell me other ways you noticed your author adapted the fairy tales. I would like you to tell me at least 2 different ways. So make sure you include the fairy tale name and if there is an author, and then 2 ways the author adapted the fairy tale. Okay? So remember, in order to know how to change our fairy tales, we need to investigate and look at all the different ways our authors can adapt fairy tales. Then I'll take all the information that you guys compiled and we'll make a big list and add to my list of ways that authors adapt fairy tales. So that way we have ideas for adapting our own. All right, writers, off you go.